Hi, I'm Jesse Litzenberg with the Schaeffler Group, the makers of FAG, ENA, and Barden bearings, and I'm here at ErieTec to talk about the 6 steps to drive efficient and effective bearing changes. Your first step to any job is to check your PPE, make sure you have your hard hats, your safety glasses, your steel toes, anything that your safety manager says you need for the job. Additionally, just make sure that you and the safety manager understand what risks there are and mitigate those risks to the best of your ability. The second step is to consult your records. You want to look at any previous records that you've kept or that your predecessor kept. You want to check your bearing part numbers to the original prints, make sure they match up. You also want to consult any workers who did the job previously, as well as any bearing representatives who were on site, and make sure everybody understands the tasks that need to be done. Step 3 is to gather your tools. You want to get your pre-installation tools, which are your micrometers and your dial indicators to check tolerances of mating components. You also want your main installation tools, which are dead blow hammers, mild steel drivers. We see people use hardened steel drivers or a brass driver, and we want to avoid those because they can cause bearing damage. On top of those things, you also want your charts for your tolerances, your clearance cards if you're doing a reduction in clearance, those kinds of items. If you have a tight fitting member, you might need a heater, so you need to get that in place as well. And then you also want to gather your rags, your cleaners, anything you're going to need post-installation to put stuff back together, maybe socket sets, those kinds of items. So step 4 is installing the bearing. And actually, before you get to installing the bearing, you have to remove the old one. Sometimes when you do this, you can nick the shaft or cause a bump in the shaft. You need to take emery cloth and make sure those are all knocked down and make sure the shaft is in good condition under where your bearing is going to sit. Part of that process is to measure the shaft and compare it to the tolerance charts. Those tolerance charts can be found on the Schaeffler Media site or in the HR1 catalog. Once that's confirmed, then you can move forward with installing the bearing. Next, you're going to start the bearing installation. Typically, the OEM provides you with an instruction sheet of how this bearing should be installed. If they don't, you're going to need to look at which member is tight fitted and which member is loose. If the shaft is a tight fit in the bearing, you're going to need to heat the bearing with an induction heater. If the housing is a tight fit, you're going to use a medium frequency induction heater to heat it up and slide the bearing in. Try to avoid using torches and open flames. The localized heating these can create can affect bearing life by changing the metal structure of the bearing or of the housing. We all know that contamination is bad for bearings and can cause premature failure. That's why it's important at this step to make sure we keep the bearing clean. In order to do this, we want to cover it when we step away, and if there's other work going on around the bearing site, we want to make sure we have them stop that work so they're not kicking up additional dust. At this point, we want to follow the OEM recommendations for lubrication. Too much lubrication can cause the bearing to churn in the lubricant, and then this generates heat. If we don't have enough lubricant, we can't separate the rolling elements from the outer race, which also generates heat and cause bearing burnup. Now, the OEM should spec in a specific amount of grease you're applying every day, week, month, or year. Sometimes that's not enough. Typically, that's in high contamination areas. If this is the case, we're happy to work with you on figuring out a new lubrication interval. At this point, the bearing should be closed up and we should be ready to put on any auxiliary equipment. For example, you could be putting on an auto lubricator to monitor how much grease is getting to this equipment. It's going to dispense a specific amount of grease at a specific interval that matches the OEM relubrication recommendations, and this just eliminates any human error in the re-greasing process. You could also be installing condition monitoring equipment such as the Schaeffler OpTime. With this, we track heat and vibration to make sure the bearing's running as we anticipated. Finally, we want to reinstall any machine guards and clean up our work site. Step 5 is to debrief. The installation is complete, and now we want to meet and talk about what went right, what went wrong, and what we could do differently. Some things we see typically in the field that really cause issues or really take us a lot of time are forgetting to do our earlier steps and having our hardware on site. Making sure you have the right lifting eyes, the right bearings, you've got your PPE, all that stuff that we already talked about. We want to make sure we're actually doing it and carried it out in this installation. And then from there, we want to update our records and make sure it reflects any changes that we made, whether that's lubrication schedule, whether we put a different bearing part number in than what the print calls out. We want to make sure that's well documented so the next person that's doing this job isn't caught guessing. The 6th and final step is the post-installation check, and this is an ongoing over the life of the bearing step. During this step, we're going to start our trend lines if we don't have historical data. So we're checking heat, we're checking vibration, we're checking temperature for this bearing if we don't have it historically. If we do have it historically, we're now comparing what readings we're getting now to what we've gotten in the past and seeing how they differ, making sure we're on the same life cycle pace for this bearing. And then additionally to this, we can check our lubrication consumption, whether that be an oil lubrication, filter, checking for contaminants, or grease usage for this bearing. Again, I'm Jesse Litzenberg with Schaeffler. Today we covered 6 steps to effectively and efficiently change your bearings. If you have any additional questions, reach out to your ErieTec representatives or your Schaeffler representatives. Thanks for watching and have a good day.